Hello, everyone. Allow me to warmly welcome you to today's seminar session, the fifth of the seminar series titled Curriculum Studies in Canada. My name is Ying Ma, postdoctorate fellow in UBC and coordinator for this seminar series. I feel very happy to facilitate today's meeting. Each seminar will be approximately 1 hour, with speakers allowed around 40 minutes to give their presentations, followed by a short Q&A segment. With the permission of each speaker, we'll be recording each session, and they will become available on both of our website, curriculumstudiesincanada.ca, as well as our YouTube channel. And today, we are very happy to have Dr. David Lewkowich from University of Alberta to give us a talk. And now, Dr. Lisa Farley from York University will give an introduction to today's speaker. Welcome.
Thank you very much. It is my pleasure to introduce David Lewkowich, who is an associate professor of secondary education at the University of Alberta, for this occasion of his presentation in the illustrious seminar series on curriculum studies in Canada. David is a prolific writer, researcher, and teacher on the meaning and status of literature, novels, poetry, graphic texts, and comics to represent the inside life of teachers and teaching. Like no one else I know, David's range of research topics within the field is as wide as his interpretations run deep. This broad depth, if you will, is captured in a glance at the many journals where his articles are published. Children's Literature Association Quarterly, Changing English, Pedagogy, Culture and Society, Curriculum Inquiry, Emotion, Space and Society, and the International Journal of Education. And I have read them all. But I first came to know David when in 2013, Professor Nicholas Ingefuk asked us both to present on a keynote panel at the Provoking Curriculum Conference in Ottawa. The dear Professor Carl Lego was also on that panel. I remember very well my first energetic handshake with David. I also remember the embrace of Carl's radiant smile and, of course, his unforgettable poem that challenged us all to find serious humor in our vulnerabilities. Then and now, and ever since, I have come to understand that David is one of those rare people who can and does take Carl's poetic advice. That is, David notices the humor of the imperfections of both research and teaching as the human condition of both. However, David's capacity to find the fun is perhaps like Carl's, also no joke, as the kids these days I've learned to say. It is precisely this capacity that allows David to deeply dive into what Britzman calls, drawing on Hannah Arendt, our unavoidable natality that confronts us over and over, not only with the pleasures, but with the terrors of having to begin. In David's research, we touch and are touched by the sore spots of beginnings in education: loneliness, abjection, boredom, exclusion, and awkwardness, all qualities that point to the humanity of teaching, even while they are more often defined as the opposite. In 2016, David stood in front of a packed audience at the University of Alberta to give a talk on his research, and it's on YouTube if you want to search it. There, he described his work perhaps better than I ever could. That is, as an examination of the psychic life of reading that invites teachers, students, and researchers to risk interpreting what he calls representationally ambiguous texts in order to think about the existential, ethical, and indeed human dilemmas of trying to teach and learn. I can think of no better time than now, as we sit together and alone on each of our own individual screens, to think through some of these dilemmas as we listen to David's paper entitled Reading, Memory, Curriculum, Body, a Psychoanalytic Dialogue. Welcome, David.
Thank you, Lisa. What a pleasure that was. I'm glad that that's being recorded so I can turn back to that when I'm feeling low. Thank you very much. And thank you as well, Dr. Panner, for the invitation to today's talk. Yeah, I'll just move straight into things then. In a graduate seminar I taught a couple years back, I asked my students to take a stab at the now fairly uncommon task of memorization, to read through the book of poetry we were sharing, Ocean Vuong's Night Sky with Exit Wounds, and choose a poem, any poem, even if just a few lines of a poem, and to live with these words and shapes of sound for a few days, to treat them as something more than a passing read, to enter and linger within the kaleidoscopic body of poem. My suspicion here was that as time passed and these readers continued to read their poems, towards and away from the page at the same time, the relationship of reader and poem would reveal itself as inherently changeable, abstract, and always in flux. My hope was that something unexpectedly new might emerge from these days spent nuzzling closely into the unreliable folds of poetry, where language can seem both welcoming and alienating at the same time. Since this was a senior level literacy course, my students, who were all experienced teachers, were also well acquainted with theories of reader response, and recognized that such variables as history, knowledge, culture, language, emotion, body age, education, from the time of day to the time of year, would undoubtedly affect how a poem is read. Though what we were doing resembled an admittedly antiquated reading practice, by asking my students to pay attention to their changing relationship with a poem, memorization was here employed as a way to enact and encounter the utter unknowability of text. Joining in this exercise with my students, I chose a poem whose unceremonious title, Thanksgiving 2006, tells the story of loneliness, longing, and a human encounter that is simultaneously erotic and filled with dread. Brooklyn's too cold tonight, and all my friends are 3 years away. My mother said I could be anything I wanted, but I chose to live. On the stoop of an old brownstone, a cigarette flares, then fades. I walk to it, a razor sharpened in silence, his jawline etched in smoke. The mouth where I re-enter this city. Stranger, palpable echo, here is my hand, filled with blood thin as a widow's tears. I am ready to be every animal you leave behind. As a young child in Winnipeg, I spent a part of my summers at a pretty intensely Christian summer camp. I seem to recall people riding on horseback with flags reminiscent of those carried by crusaders in medieval holy wars. We sang a variety of songs about God and scripture, and even now as I think back, a number of seemingly inconsequential, incompatible memories spring quickly to mind. I also remember practicing memorization and sitting with other campers, reciting verses for which, if we could actually recite them correctly, we could build a small collection of fancifully colored award ribbons, and I can only presume a certain sense of satisfaction. Brooklyn's too cold tonight, and all my friends are 3 years away. Let the words of my mouth and the meditation of my heart be acceptable in thy sight. Psalms 19:14. I don't know anymore, however, what the satisfaction of this kind of religious memorization actually feels like. Indeed, I've long given up belief in such things. And now as I reach the end of a sentence, like a day well spent in the haze of fatigue, I often seem to have forgotten the opening words. But still, familiar words feel good and they do bring me back. I'm just not totally certain where or when they bring me back to. And in this regard, this unique state of embodied learning raises questions that are not unlike the relation between what we see and what we know, which, as John Berger describes, is never finally settled. Is reading still reading when a poem becomes an apparition, whose floating fragments are held together by breath and body rather than story? As traces of human and more than human encounters materialize somewhere between appearance and dissipation, between a fading out and a fading in? What is it that readers use of themselves to compel such spirits to life? On the stoop of an old brownstone, on the stoop of an old brownstone, on the stoop of an old brownstone. Divorced away, these words are no longer what they were, but instead a half-formed whisper of something else becoming something else, a word misheard, a stutter stopped before stuttered at all. It's this misty hint of one thing in another that I will use as a guiding principle for this talk. A North Star that is actually a triple star, religious only in the sense that its body is more like a holy ghost than a statue, more like a flicker of love and memory than a thing that can actually be counted and touched, his jawline etched in smoke. In what follows, I'm going to reference some of my recent work in literary and curriculum studies, tying together, at least in proposition, the floating worlds of the reader and their intonations of memory, body, and image in reading experience. Drawing from psychoanalytic theory, I will share two different research stories, one of a reader and one of a text. And throughout what follows, I continually summon Mary Aswell Dahl's suggestion regarding the interrelation of dreams and learning. Education should not just lead out, she tells us, it should also lead in. So in my first story, I will present the case of one reader who uses poetry and art to respond to a difficult text, sharing similarly difficult details from her past, interwoven with an intergenerational story about a family member she had never met. I will first begin, though, with a reference to psychoanalyst Wilfred Bion's metaphorical notion of the caesura. In his short paper on this topic, Bion begins by citing directly from Freud, who writes, quote, "There is much more continuity between intrauterine life and earliest infancy than the impressive caesura of the act of birth allows us to believe. Just as the shapes, colors, and sounds of sensory perceptions may distract from what they are not, so the impressive caesura of birth makes it appear as if human consciousness only begins at the very moment that the baby is born. When something in the natural world changes from one category of being to another, caterpillar to butterfly, tadpole to frog, babble to word, it can often appear erroneously anew, as if the form that now exists had nothing at all to do with that which came before. In the case of human development and experience, the movement between comparable categories of transformation, from wordlessness to speaking being, child to adult, experience to memory, thought and feeling to articulation, typically involves a form of amnesia that silently renders the past as perpetual servant to the present. Memories, Adam Phillips tells us, become forms of forgetting. Along with Freud, however, Bion questions this logic. And though it remains impossible to physically return to a time before the caesura, separating an event from its eventual articulation, he insists that in the present, we have to have a method of formulation which can penetrate the barrier. So with this intent, he advises his readers to sharpen their interpretive focus to look only on spaces between. Not the analyst, he emphasizes, not the analysand, not the unconscious, not the conscious, not sanity, not insanity, but the caesura, the link, the synapse. Bion's theory of looking between therefore presents a model for encountering the continuity between states and events, which, though they may seem different, are actually closely linked. As I discuss in this research story, Bion's conceptual imperative can also be used to visualize a breach between memory, or rather a memory's original experience, and its eventual screen. Following Philip's suggestion that from a psychoanalytic point of view, our lives are always other lives, I consider a reader's creation of art as a method for consciously screening difficult memory, and examine the question of how a traumatic past, as indestructible as it is also surely incomprehensible, may be represented through a strategy of intergenerational, interpsychic displacement. In my examination of a reader's encounter with difficult knowledge, this narrative emerges from a small study I conducted with a group of undergraduate students, involving future high school English teachers in collaborative interpretation with 4 contemporary graphic novels about adolescent experience. As a group, these readers met once a month to consider a different text, And as a means to guide our discussion, I asked them to create a visual response that somehow illustrated their personal identifications with the text. In these responses, readers created a variety of shapes, visual stories, and semiotic gestures, many of which illuminated the importance of memory in the lives of adult readers. And though we read 4 texts in total, I'm going to focus here on one reader's interpretive response to Linda Berry's The Freddy Stories, which traces a year in the life of a young boy named Freddy, here's the book, who endures bullying, abuse, and teasing at school, and eventually suffers a severe dissociative episode. This is an admittedly dark narrative, and given the suffering that Freddy endures, it is no surprise that many of these readers responded with their own stories of difficult and traumatic histories. The reader whose words and artistic efforts inform this story is here named Suzanne, who at the time of our shared reading was a 21-year-old Indigenous woman from a small town in northern Alberta. And though she speaks an Indigenous language, she also writes poetry in English, while describing her relationship to this language as emotionally estranged. It kind of feels like English just doesn't belong to me, she said, or I don't belong to it. Given the historic and ongoing context of colonization in Canada, it is not surprising to encounter Suzanne's palpable sense of alienation towards English. As Indigenous scholar and curriculum writer Robina Ann Thomas notes, First Nations peoples have ways of knowing and being, but for the most part, these were stripped from us through the process of colonization. Against this history, however, Thomas proposes that drawing attention to the power of Indigenous story can provide an important counter-narrative as, quote, a means through which these ways of knowing and being can be uncovered or reclaimed. Along with the group discussions, I also conducted 2 individual interviews with Suzanne. And in our second meeting, she described her personal motivations for writing. The Creator, she told me, gave me this way of expression to honor those who were here before me, and also to leave something behind for those that are going to come after. As a writer, Suzanne therefore views her creative practice as intimately related to the presence of temporal traces, recognizing and celebrating her inheritance of the traces left by others, while also viewing herself as an important part of this ensemble and an author of future traces. For Métis author Judy Iseki, telling and retelling stories connects the past as remembered in the present with and for the future. As a way to contextualize Suzanne's responses to the Freddy Stories, I will briefly describe the author's afterword to the 2012 edition of her graphic novel, which, unlike the rest of the book, adopts a directly authorial voice. And I'll try to share my screen here to share a couple of these images. Oh, am I able to share my screen? Thank you. Okay. Additionally, while these pages are titled an afterword, they also precede a series of panels dubbed the Lost Stories, narratives left out from the first iteration of Freddy's history, originally published in the 1990s. As Berry herself describes, this initial exclusion represented a form of narrative amnesia. When this collection was first put together, she wrote, some strips were left out for being too strange or depressing. Finally appearing in book form, however, these stories occupy a strange and awkward position, an uncanny reminder of an overlooked past. Yet, in reading these previously displaced panels as part of Freddy's larger story, readers effectively conjoin past and present, remembered and forgotten histories, no matter how dissimilar these categories may otherwise seem. The when in a comic strip is always now, Barry tells us, the same now you are in this instant, no matter what year of your life you are in today. Sounding particularly playful, Barry also describes how the paradoxical manner in which the unacknowledged or the forgotten, misplaced, and repressed persists within the acknowledged reveals an unusually dialectic relation between the caesura separating things seen from unseen, things lost when found and found when lost. As I describe in what follows, Suzanne adopts a similar understanding regarding the interactions of story and memory as arrangements that conceal and contain at the very same time. Before addressing her visual response, Suzanne speculated that, there we go, I'll have to move back and forth. Suzanne speculated that as an author, Lynda Barry has been able to use fiction as a means of indirectly discussing her own life and the lives of those she cares about, turning to fiction as a kind of double process of revelation and concealment. It seemed to me, Suzanne told us, that she was expressing something that had been suppressed for a long time, either by her or another family member. Acknowledging the things that we wish we could express but we can't, Suzanne also recognized that given the lag between the lost and found in Freddie's stories, the process of self-expression often takes time, and that what is now silent in and about herself might not always have to be so. In other words, as a reader, Suzanne found support in Barry's expression of belated knowledge, while also describing how a process of working through trauma or injury involves a period of inherent latency, which, as Dominic Lecapra writes, does not mean avoidance, but a process of repetition with significant difference. Though the content of Freddie's stories remains the same as when they were first written, their new arrangement, a repetition with difference, interrupts what may have previously been taken for granted. As Christopher Bolus tells us, the psychic function of doing history, transforming the past into a history, involves reviewing and reshaping the past, thus inspiring renewed recognition of the creative function of our psychological capacity to see our life in continually new ways. As Suzanne described her experiences of reading and responding to Barry's text, quote, "It was kind of healing because I realized that there are parts of me that are hurting that I never even knew were there, and that in connection with past generations, when they're hurting, I'm hurting too." By the end, she told us, I was able to write and release some of those emotions. Doing the psychic work of history, this particular reader appears to suggest involves a recognition of emotional life as potentially following a separate timeline from that of everyday existence, perhaps even traveling across the invisible boundaries of generations. Telling stories, however, is not a simple matter. And though Suzanne described the experience of reading with others in positive terms, sometimes, she acknowledged, to create, it hurts. Because you're taking those parts of you that are in pain and trying to make something out of it. As Thomas King describes, stories are wondrous things, and they are dangerous. For once a story is told, it cannot be called back. In an effort to respect the risks that Suzanne and others took, I made sure to never personally ask them to justify their visual and narrative efforts, letting their words and images stand as written and drawn, nor will I now attempt to explain away these uncertain and unfinished elements. Moreover, though Suzanne has obviously experienced various traumas in her life, I will leave the question of what such trauma looks like unresolved. Instead, my focus here is on how Suzanne tells her story and what she accomplishes with the changing form and structure of her visual responses. In this regard, in this regard, I follow Brushwood Rose and Granger in being, quote, less interested in what these stories convey about experience and more interested in what it is we use stories to do. Turning back to Beyond's analytic priorities, my methodological choices also represent a conscious endeavor to dwell, along with Suzanne, within the undecided and undecidable moments of reading experience, where rather than focusing on the meaning of plot and direction, I look instead to movement and transition. Though Beyond's concept of the caesura since it is neither here nor there, neither after the breach of understanding nor before, may appear as an abstract concept, it nonetheless allows for the possibility of what is not immediately comprehensible. As he writes, to limit ourselves to the observation only of what we understand is denying ourselves the raw material on which present and possibly future wisdom and knowledge might depend. As a curriculum scholar, I appreciate the value that such methodological humility brings to the study of reading and emotional experience. In her first visual response, Suzanne enwrapped her own words in the image of a raindrop, surrounded by a single continuous line from Barry's text. And these are the words around the raindrop. It was raining so much light in the raindrops on the windshield, you can see 1,000 worlds in them. And Suzanne then read her own difficult poem of 1,000 worlds out loud, which I will do now while this image is here. I remember the first time I wanted to die. I was 9. Someone did something to me I did not know about. I thought I was pregnant. I was 9. You can say it's sad now, but you weren't there. And I know you were only worried about the same things too. It's okay. It's hard to help someone if you are broken too. I know that now. I'm sorry. I'm so sorry. I am out talking to the birds because we speak the same language. I say to them, I am broken. They say, fly, we will cry for you. I trust them. My family thinks I'm crazy. I have nothing to cry for. Why are you crying? Why are you crying? Why are you crying? I want to go home. I hope there's some place to go home too. I know you feel it too. Your voice echoes inside me. I want to go home. I want to go home. I want to go home. I wish I could reach back and take the sadness away, but you lived years before me. I hope your soul is happy now. I hope you are free. They tell me all I need is the 10 commandments. If I follow them, I will be worthy. If I follow them, I will be reborn. But heaven is not a place I belong to. I'm not sure I even belong in this world. Sex is supposed to be a beautiful thing, and my body is supposed to be a place I feel at home in. But how do I make a home in my mind? After reading her poem, Suzanne broke down in tears and had to temporarily leave the room. While we waited for her return, the rest of us sat in silence and contemplation about Suzanne's words. I considered the honesty, the rawness and brutality, the beauty of her expression, the shifting subject, the use of image, the position of address, the repeated plea, I want to go home, I want to go home, I want to go home. This image of a falling raindrop, while visually equivalent to that of a tear, temporary, vulnerable, always in motion, a structure whose form is necessarily uncertain, a liquid that is yet a body, is also an appropriate symbol for the way that Suzanne used her poem to connect a variety of stories and perspectives. In the single raindrop, Suzanne articulated stories of herself, of birds, of past generations, of fictional characters, of different worlds held momentarily together, caught in the frayed and untold edges where memory touches and is hardly different from narrative. As Jonathan Sillen writes, impelled to tell our story, we are of necessity forced to find a language adequate to its message. And for Suzanne, her language is poetry, where autobiographical elements are safely refused the demands of narrative closure. Similarly, using the influence of Barry's art, Suzanne developed what Marion Hirsch calls a biocular text, asking us to read back and forth between the materiality of words and the discursivity and narrativity of images. In this single raindrop, fleeting and transient in composition of image and word, Suzanne contained an endlessly shattered image, refracted as light through water. And though her poem is partly a journey through memory, it also functions as a recognition of the ways in which, through movements of displacement in remembering, memories, like dreams, are always centered differently. Moreover, through such difference and by staying focused on fleeting moments, Suzanne suggests how the past may be reworked. reconfigured, and migrated to new and uncertain forms of unexpected representation. As Lee Miracle contends, there are no standard ways to remember, no single methodology. And in this sense, Suzanne's raindrop, after the cloud and before the puddle, functions like the open wound of working through, where so long as it keeps falling and stays in motion, the meaning of past events remains forever and productively unsettled. For our final meeting, and though this was not something I had requested or expected, Suzanne prepared a second visual response, which was actually a reconstruction of her first. By allowing certain elements of her first response to grow faint, Suzanne magnified a story of being homesick and speaking the language of birds. As it says on the image here, I am out talking to the birds because we speak the same language. I say to them, I am broken. They say, fly. We will cry for you. I trust them. Everyone thinks I'm crazy. I have nothing to cry for. Why are you crying? Why are you crying? Why are you crying? I want to go home. I hope there's some place to go home too. I know you feel it too. Your voice echoes inside me. I want to go home. I want to go home. I want to go home. I wish I could reach back and take all the sadness away, but you lived years before me. I hope your soul is happy now. I hope you are free. I thanked Suzanne for this unexpected reimagining, and when I asked if she had anything further that she wanted to share regarding these visual poems, she told me, whenever I write, I try to give justice to the people in my life that I feel didn't get the chance. For this one, Suzanne continued, it was based on someone in my family, a great uncle, who had mental health problems but was sent from our community to an institution and just kept there for all of his life. Though she had never met him, Suzanne inhabits her great uncle's voice in poem, while also reading her own story as a refracted image of his. How can we doubt, Marc Auger asks, that we live several lives simultaneously? Talking about her reparative wish to reach back into the past and free her great uncle from the bonds of institutional confinement, we can also sense the silent presence of a wish regarding Suzanne's traumatic history. Though it is absent in language, Suzanne's history therefore insinuates itself within and through the words of another. As an author and reader of memory traces, Suzanne allows that the rearrangement of memory need not necessarily be limited to only one person's life, but that the memories of those who lived in the past may be reimagined in the present context of aesthetic production. This second poem is thus a further refracted image of the first, a distillation of a distillation that nonetheless continues to carry its history undiluted. He was sent away to this mental institution, Suzanne continued, and I guess where he was staying, he was treated very badly and he was neglected. And when my grandma went to go see him, his feet were rotting in his shoes. So he wrote one letter to my grandma, but he didn't know much English. And all it said on it was, I want to go home. So that's what I'm talking about when I'm saying, I want to go home. I want to go home. I want to go home. I wish I could reach back and take all the sadness away, but you lived years before me, and I hope your soul is happy now. I hope you are free. Changing the central image, displacing her words, yet leaving them otherwise untouched, and thereby enacting a repetition with significant difference, Suzanne used her art and story to open the bounds of memory to continuous revision, treating her past experience as interwoven with those of generational others, and also as inherently unsettled as movable words of a poem, always on the very verge of collapse. In regards to Beyond's theory of looking between, I'll stop that, to consider the caesura of narrative life between the story and storyteller appears to involve a space where stories of self diverge from egoic certainty, and indeed may even appear to turn away from the self completely. Since we cannot help but live with different versions of ourselves, it is no surprise that telling personal stories may often feel like an alienation, just as telling stories of others may often feel uncomfortably close. I'm here reminded of the alchemy involved in memorization. As someone else's poem becomes embedded in the reader's life and reading body, the mouth where I re-enter this city is a different mouth from Ocean Vuong's, but a mouth whose ridges I can actually touch. Indeed, writing and talking about others, and even with the words of others, may paradoxically bring us closer to ourselves than writing about ourselves could ever do. Moreover, when it comes to the half-spoken history of traumatic experience, a method of consciously writing away from memory or articulating a version of someone else's memory that is not personally remembered may also allow readers to more fully explore the emotional effects of reading as it relates to their own belated knowledge. As Suzanne's responses illustrate, memories, if approached through the narratively undetermined corridors of poetry, may be voiced and kept silent at the same time. And by situating herself as between generational boundaries, Suzanne interprets the past, including the lives of silenced others, as still living, belated, and finally readable in poetic form. There are things from the past, as Phillips notes, that are in fact sustained by being recontextualized. As Ocean Vuong indicates, the strongest poems allow themselves to collapse completely before even suggesting resurrection or closure, and a manipulation of form can add another dimension to that collapse. Things are built as they have fallen, and for the indeterminate space of caesura, forever in movement towards and from and always newly refractable, each moment can be other than what it is. Indeed, each moment is other than it is, and birth is just as likely as death to be an indication of what will be. If the poem, as Paul Valery famously suggested, is always unfinished, then the past, at least in a poetic and a psychoanalytic sense, is therefore never past. But as with the caesura, is a break, whether in the mind or elsewhere, after which there is continuity. Though what is past remains in the past, it can also be written and imagined anew again and again and again. Now, in my second research story, I'm going to turn to a televisual text to further explore the uses of memory production, thinking particularly about the ways in which adolescent memories, so I'm shifting gears here a bit, will surely interact with the pre-service teacher's developing sense of teacher identity. In activities usually referred to as reflections or journaling, students in the process of learning to teach, as I'm sure we have all seen, are frequently asked to re-inhabit the memories of past experience. The idea being that such contemplation will enable them to use such experience as a guide for future action. There is, however, some pretty complex and often unacknowledged memory work involved in these projects, especially complicated by the fact that many of these experiences relate to a time in the midst of emotion and action, where memory itself is inescapably hard to grasp. Just as Thomas Ogden writes of the ineffability of psychoanalysis, lived emotional experience cannot be translated, transcribed, recorded, explained, understood, or told in words, which may be why such models as art and literature, such as Suzanne's in my previous story, are often used to indirectly represent the interiority of such experience. And of course, though teacher education tends to focus on the educational, no matter the sort of experience in question, every memory contains inexpressible qualities that representation cannot know, as the methodological question of memory becomes a question of interpretation without necessarily also knowing. To follow this challenging logic, while memories generally refer to what happened in the past, they also indicate meanings that may have nothing to do with the past at all, and which just as surely relate to the social context of remembering as to the moment remembered. As an example, for those who examine themselves as future teachers of adolescence, their memories of adolescent life, sure to emerge at a variety of unexpected moments, will be informed by a number of intersecting factors: their lived experiences of adolescence, both remembered and forgotten, the social context of teacher education, as well as their hopes, fears, and desires about their future classrooms and future students. So in this research story, I therefore take it for granted that thinking about memories of adolescence in the context of teaching, or learning to teach, involves a tour through parts of the self that cannot be known. And given its focus on how we share our lives with people and fantasies we have failed to realize, I turn to psychoanalysis again to help conceptualize a theory of memory as creative imaginary construction, while also thinking about the past as a resource for creating the future in similarly imaginative terms. What does it look like, I wonder, for the adult to stage their adolescent past with both the present and future simultaneously in mind? Following Melanie Klein's assertion that nothing that ever existed in the unconscious completely loses its influence, I here conceive the enduring presence of adolescent life as an unconscious force that extends interminably into adulthood. As Deborah Britzman tells us, there is no final goodbye to adolescence. And as an emotional constellation born of developmental change, the unconscious logics of adolescent life and all its anxieties, defenses, preoccupations, passions, and idealizations return most powerfully when adults experience the need to mediate between the borderland of what they know and what they do not. Adolescents, after all, are stealthy and expert border crossers, and adults continue to depend on this expertise throughout their lives. As Louise Kaplan describes it as the conjugator of childhood and adulthood, our persistent reliance on the emotional labor of such conjugation signals that even if our teenage years are fast forgotten or disavowed, the past and present will continually overlap. In my work at the university, I often witness this overlapping as future teachers return to the sites of their own adolescence in memory, as a way to ponder the question of teaching adolescent others. Though I usually encourage this return, as with curriculum scholars such as Pinar, Selvio, and Miller, I simultaneously troubled the idea of viewing the past as a knowable thing, and suggest that rather than thinking about remembering as a way to describe past lives, to reconceptualize its focus as an engagement with inner lives, both past and present at the same time. Thinking, again, with Wilfred Bion's belief in any number of different caesuras, I here argue that methods of thinking back in memory while relaying the past need to simultaneously accentuate the present context of remembering, staging memory as a relation rather than representation. Okay, I'll try to share this again. So as an example of how memory may be employed to stage the relation between adolescence and adulthood, I'll here present the case of Hulu's Pen 15, a television show that features two adults playing versions of themselves in seventh grade, while surrounded by a supporting cast composed of actual seventh graders. If we take the timelessness that characterizes unconscious life seriously, where, as in a dream, nothing ever dies, including younger selves, memories, and feelings, then this show reflects the kind of remembrance and psychic situation that teachers embody each day, as their adult selves encounter the past in the students they teach. In what follows, I focus on one particular episode from the first season, though before I discuss the show in any further detail, I want to consider the potential of theorizing remembrance as a form of anamnesis, and briefly introduce some of the predominant characteristics of adolescent states of mind. Following my discussion of Pen 15, I will also turn briefly to Marc Augier's concept of the non-place, through which I propose a focus on the elusive aspects of adolescence as a way of helping my students feel their way into the emotional recapitulations of teaching life. So firstly, anamnesis. In Plato's Timaeus, the question of conceptualizing beginnings through a process referred to as anamnesis is presented as an exercise in remembrance, in which remembering involves a series of related interior moves. As John Sallis writes, quote, "It is to bring back to a certain presence something that nonetheless in its pastness is and remains absent. It is therefore to bring the dead alive, while also recognizing the inescapable irreversibility of time moving forward. This is remembering as reimagining, re-envisioning, re-inhabiting, returning." For Julia Kristeva, the aims of psychoanalysis are actually similar to those of anamnesis. And as she comments, Freud founded psychoanalysis as an invitation to anamnesis, with the aim of a rebirth, or in other words, a psychical restructuring. However, instead of reaching the past lives, as Platonic theory proposes, psychoanalytic anamnesis involves the possibility of entering as far as possible into the most distant memories of our childhood, even reaching beyond the advent of language. In psychoanalytic remembrance as anamnesis, we therefore encounter a turn backward to a past beyond memory and beyond our representations of it, which also presents an alternative to the strict association of remembering with fact and documentary proof, and instead conceives its process as anti-mimetic, deep within the body and inherently creative. In my work with pre-service teachers, as I described in my first research story, I encourage a similar search for meaning. For instance, while reading various stories about adolescent life, I often ask students to visualize the memories that they encounter while reading, a practice that exemplifies the confluence of past and present lives that intersect in the moment of reading. As an example, one student created this 4-panel narrative to accompany her reading of, again, the graphic novel, the Freddy Stories, which, as I've already described, it's a graphic novel that tells the narrative of a young boy's traumatic childhood. While sharing this visual creation, this particular student noted the tendency of adults to unknowingly change their past experiences while remembering them. Everybody as teenagers, she told me, goes through overwhelming things. And then as an adult, we can look back and say, oh, that's why this was happening to me. So you sort of amend your memories in a way. Though a graphic representation of adolescence, the student's subsequent recognition of remembering as amendment describes the performative nature of memory work in teacher education. That when the adult occupies their adolescence in memory, they cannot help but do so from the vantage of adulthood, a viewpoint that necessarily also modifies the past. As I will note in my discussion of Pen 15, the uses of anamnesis help to make conspicuous the multiple ways in which remembering inevitably shapes memory. In the context in which I work and teach, I therefore encourage others to think beyond seeing reflection and recollection as a means of knowing the self in self-evident fashion. Instead, as with Kristeva, I value moves that displace the past and through which we may stage memories less as fact than as an uncertain form of dynamic and always surprising relation, a function akin to dreaming and poetry. In this view, remembering adolescence is not an engagement with a thing, but a process. And the question I ask my students is how we may represent a past that cannot be known. In her recent work, Margot Waddell notes that she is less concerned with conceptualizing adolescence as a strictly defined age group than as a process of moving towards adulthood. As an experience of managing the physical and psychic anxieties of development, this process includes a variety of states of mind, which, though they may occur in the teenage years, may also be found in people of all age groups. As she puts it, the adult may be found in the baby, the infant and the adolescent, the young child and the old man, the middle-aged man and the 7-year-old boy. In Waddell's account, then, adolescent states of mind, which we may use to understand the performative nature of the adult remembering, include a confusing series of contradictory desires and poles. Quote, between the adult and the infantile, between the tender and the aggressive, between acquisitive greed and generosity, between elation and depression, between the lures of dishonesty and the desire for truth, between hate and love, between a sense of confusion and a conviction of certainty. So as I move into my discussion of Pen 15, it is worth considering the ways in which remembering adolescence will surely feel bewildering, as it dramatizes and reactivates these contradictory states of mind as a means to also consider the past anew. So taking seriously the idea that as we grow into adulthood, the person who we were in 7th grade is still an enduring part of our personality, the show's creators and star actors pictured here, Maya Erskine on the left and Anna Konkol on the right, they proposed Pen 15 as an ode to the rejects, referring both to young people themselves and, I think, as well, to the adults' adolescent past, often rejected by those same adults who confuse forgetting with something resembling resolution. For the makers of this show, however, it is precisely such forgetting that they want to disturb. And if we consider the contradictory nature of adolescent states of mind, the ode of Pen 15 combines a grief about leaving familiar things with an excitement about the new and the unknown. In Erskine and Konkol's interrogation of these oppositional forces, They effectively suggest a form of remembering that simultaneously reiterates and reinvents the past in present form. As a model for memory work in teacher education, such remembering may involve bringing the pre-service teachers' younger selves into explicit conflict with their developing professional identities, striving towards a recognition that neither can ever be fully unraveled from the other, nor that they should be. And while I hesitate to prescribe or even suggest what this kind of remembering might actually look like, I would emphasize that at every moment, the question of whether the past is speaking through the present or the present through the past should remain productively unsettled. For instance, following an episode in which the character of Maya, who like the actor herself is Japanese American, experienced racism close to that which Erskine actually endured as a young adolescent, Erskine notes how despite the difference in displacement between this version of events and what actually happened, the emotional force of the past remains unchanged. It was pulled directly from reality, Erskine shared about this scene, but a lot of the emotions and names that were thrown at me came from reality. I thought I had gotten over that, and I didn't realize how raw and how present those emotions were to the surface. Though the scenery may change from past to present, from one scene to another, from adolescence to adulthood, it seems that emotions cannot be so easily or deliberately transformed. As Erskine continued to describe this feeling of emotional surprise, as soon as we started acting it, I realized, wow, this still really hurts just as badly as it did when it happened. And I don't know that that pain ever goes away. It can get smaller, but it's always there. Though this scene is admittedly a fiction invented and performed, the effects of this performance reveal the persistent and timeless character of the adolescent in pain. And for the actor who played this scene, her acting is a form of creative remembering that moves past the narratives, memories, and physical details to an emotional fabric that remains unchanged, and which, until remembered, apparently could not be seen. What is at issue here, then, is not the truth value of the fictional performance, but the difference that it makes in renewing and restructuring the psychic life of the person remembering. So in Miranda, the second episode of Pen 15's first season, the two main characters are caught between the contradictory desires of childhood play and the need for something else. As I move through this episode and read its narrative as a performance of remembering that is nonetheless not remembering, I will pay particular attention to those moments where the meaning of adulthood and adolescence is made especially conspicuous. So the episode opens with Maya and Anna childishly acting out scenes with their collection of Sylvanian family dolls. Though the scenes themselves are far from childish, including discussion of extramarital sex, fidelity in marriage, and parental responsibility. As 13-year-olds, these characters are thus invoking some pretty mature content, which makes it no surprise that when they are teased at school for owning these dolls, they start considering how to involve themselves in more adult forms of play outside the dollhouse. As Anna says repeatedly, when Maya seems bored of pretend, let's just do something else. In their incessant search for something new, Maya and Anna find a cigarette that a group of popular girls had accidentally dropped on the bathroom floor. And if the dollhouse is a symbol for childhood, where everything is pretend and miniature, the cigarette is an obvious sign of adulthood, towards which the girls are alternately repelled and compelled. Later in the evening, after pretending to smoke the cigarette in bed, engaging in play with this new and alluring object, Maya tells Anna, we should totally smoke this, it would be so chill. To which Anna responds, yeah, it would be chill. I'm just not 100% sure I'm ready to be a smoker. While playing with the cigarette is one thing, still safely on the side of the child, lighting it up appears to be another. Perhaps to facilitate a slower and gentler entry into adulthood, Maya then proposes a compromise, but she suggests, maybe we should get a lighter to play better, thereby slightly shifting their versions of play, along with the identities they assume and the accessories they demand, clinging to the dollhouse while chasing the cigarette. After buying a lighter, they end up outside of a house in which Miranda, the popular girl who dropped her cigarette in the earlier scene, is hanging out with her friends in her parents' garage. As with the cigarette, Maya and Anna are torn between desires, whether to join these girls or head safely home. Should we spy on them, Maya wonders, prompting Anna to accentuate the tenuous divide between child and adult. What are you doing, she asks. We're having a sleepover. which presupposes that what they should be doing is playing with Sylvanian family dolls. However, just like her plan to play better, Maya suggests that play may offer a non-committal means of experimenting with and on the borders of childhood, less just like ding dong and ditch, she proposes, though Anna suspects that her friend's motivations are not so innocent. Oh my God, she says, appearing aghast. You wanted ding dong and stay. Indeed, it turns out they both want to stay, though neither wants to be the first to admit it. As if to break this spell of indecision, the garage door opens and Miranda invites the girls inside, where she is waiting with two of her friends for a group of 5 good-looking brothers. As the evening proceeds, it therefore seems that the stakes for Maya and Anna get exponentially higher as the perils of adulthood multiply, from cigarettes to boys, and then from getting drunk to getting high. As they wait for one of these boys, one of Miranda's friends produces a can of beer, which initially worries Anna, who fearfully runs to the bathroom and stares at her own reflection. When she returns, though, she is soon upset that Maya has taken a sip of the beer without her, which compels Anna to quickly grab the can and drink it all in one sip. Trying to outdo her friend, Maya then huffs from a container of computer cleaner and passes out temporarily on the sofa. In their rush to experiment with new and different forms of intoxication, Anna and Maya get increasingly angry and frustrated that they cannot experience these milestones at the exact same time. Throughout this episode, there thus appears an anxiety regarding the timings of adulthood and whether such timing can be deliberately delayed or accelerated. When the brothers arrive, the girls are chosen one by one by the boys in a ritual disturbingly reminiscent of high school gym class. As Anna and Maya are unsurprisingly left to the very end, both get stuck with the youngest brothers, in Anna's case, an 8-year-old, that blonde boy on the end there. And as she turns away from her friend, Maya tells her, well, we can't do everything together. As they disappear with their partners, their respective scenes describe a continuation of the adolescent struggle between the borders of childhood and adulthood. For instance, though he seems unable to relate, he is after all 8 years old, Anna confides in the boy that she's with that her separation from Maya feels unnecessarily rushed. All of a sudden, she says while crying, it's like everything can just change in a flip or an instant. Though she doesn't explicitly state her concerns, Maya enacts her unwillingness to move swiftly into adulthood by repeatedly procrastinating with the boy she feels pressure to kiss and with whom she's trapped in a closet. She moves towards him, then quickly ducks his advance and dances around in snake-like fashion, calling herself a dragon. She then slips into an adult's jacket that is hanging from the closet door and, suspending herself along with the jacket, calls herself a scarecrow. Finally, though she still pretends that she wants to kiss the boy, she again rejects his advances. Hoot, hoot, she voices while turning her face away. I'm an owl now. Shape-shifting between a series of creatures, Maya uses the protean spirit of play and pretend as a way to navigate the encroaching boundaries of adulthood, while also delaying the arrival of boundaries that she does not yet want to cross. Since both owls and scarecrows are often used as decoys to scare away birds, and seeing how Maya is wearing an adult's jacket, her impression of the adult here coincides with her impersonation of these creatures, which keeps the impression alive as impression rather than slipping dangerously forward into reality. She is, after all, still playing. The decoy nature of the decoy adult thus communicates Maya's emotional struggle as a place of continual conjugation and vacillation, where Maya stands somewhere on the brink of change and on the bridge of before and after, delayed in a literally suspended state of not yet conjugated. As an instance of remembering that is not remembering, this scene describes a poetic function of memory, which operates not as representation or evidence of the past, but as an acknowledgement of the disguises concealed within the layers of what is remembered. Squeezed between the temporal nodes of past, present, and future, the memory presses upon a fact of history that is always other than simply fact, and where remembering, as anamnesis, is performed alongside, opposite to, and in the margins of history. In the episode's final scene, while Maya and Anna recognize that certain of their more infantile pursuits may eventually be abandoned, they also describe the emotional needs of adolescence as an unstable passage between the stability of what is known and the risks of what is not. This strange and wandering path is once again embodied by the alternately seductive and repulsive qualities of the dollhouse and the cigarette. As the girls get ready for bed, the cigarette falls from Anna's pocket, and they promise that when they eventually smoke it, they will do so together. Maya then places it safely in the Sylvanian family dollhouse. So while it remains available for future use, any truly forward movement will also require a circling back through the structures and feelings of youth. As an emblem of adolescent anamnesis, the cigarette in the dollhouse professes the possibility of remembering as a process that looks not only to the past, but in which the past is imaginatively conjoined to present and future aspects of self. As a form of remembering that is not remembering, this is a way to use the past through errant strategies of displacement, juxtaposition, performance, and disguise as a means to exceed the meaning of limit and to turn these temporal borders into a passage. So as I end this research story, I want to return to the scene of my teaching and ponder the question of why the performance of adolescent memories may be regarded as a productive task for students who are learning to teach. If much of early childhood is forgotten or unconsciously displaced, many of the qualities of adolescence are often unconsciously disavowed, hidden between the more identifiable locations of childhood and adulthood. In fact, as an invisible influence, adolescence functions similarly to Marc Augé's description of non-places, which, like the airport or the bus station, are often found in transit and travel, and in which a traveler might find themselves relieved of usual determinants. Though we are not lost in a non-place, we may be temporarily dislocated from the demands of history and identity, finding ourselves in a space where what reigns is the urgency of the present moment. Have you been to Copenhagen? A friend asks me. Well, sort of, not really, I've been to the airport. If understood as the non-place of human development, it is no surprise that the very question of remembering adolescence is often forgotten, just as travelers ignore the spaces where they find themselves in transit. However, it seems that if we ignore these spaces, we do so at our peril, since what we are able to see and touch is always formed in relation to what we cannot. Following Augé's theory, which is here presented as a way to understand the persistent influence of unknowable past experience, the opposed polarities of place and non-place resemble the interactions of the inner lives of childhood, adulthood, and adolescence. The first, he writes, is never completely erased. The second, never totally completed. They are like palimpsests on which the scrambled game of identity and relations is ceaselessly rewritten. Even in adulthood, the influence of adolescence is still being written, which is why any form of remembering about this time of life necessarily situates and reanimates the past in the present context of the person remembering. If I look back to myself at 16 years old, the contradictory emotional life at this time remains an important part of who I am today. And somewhere deep within me, there is an adolescent still in pain, who continues to ask the questions whose answers I cannot bear to know. The least I can do from the vantage I now possess is not pretend that things have somehow finally been resolved. For students learning to teach, it is important to recognize that adolescence persists in some of our deepest and most defensive forms of emotional identification, when, who, and how we turn towards, and when, who, and how we turn away. The roots of these movements may form in the womb, but they also continue to thread through our various pasts as infants, young children, adolescents, etc., as they also affect how teachers turn towards their students and towards the knowledge that they help produce. As expressed in my reading of Pen 15, the performance of adolescent anamnesis is a way of recognizing that remembering is never only about facts, but about the ways in which adolescence continues to do its lifelong work of conjugation. In essence, I use these forms of remembering as a way to describe the difference between what an adolescence is and what adolescence does, and to help my students feel their way into the emotional recapitulations of teaching life, using remembering as a means to live in new forms of relation with the past. So turning once again and finally to the poem that I chose to memorize some years back, I am reacquainted with the images and impressions I grafted out of my earlier readings of this evocative text. Seeing these images now as I built them then, not clear, but it's a feeling of clarity and of familiarity. I can recognize how the memorized poem becomes a marker of time, and one that also continues to move as I now carry this poem beyond the page itself. And if you are familiar with the movie Beetlejuice, you'll know why I say this word 3 times. The North Star is also a triple star. Even now, at this very moment, when I read such lines as "Brooklyn's too cold tonight," "On the stoop of an old brownstone, a razor sharpened in silence, the mouth where I re-enter this city," I take a tour through every instant of myself who read these words, and every memory conjured and quickly forgotten, until the meaning of a poem, this poem, any poem, becomes an amalgamation of past experience, which surely can never be put into words, yet is also just as surely there each time these words pass through my body, becoming breath on tongue. Given the research stories I've shared today, one of a reader and one of text, both of which speak to the reinvention and reanimation of memory and story, I will end this talk by sharing a visual response in which I use the practice of collage as a way to embody my ever-developing relationship with this poem. As a method of inquiry, and in this case, and in this particular case, reader response, collage involves cutting, experimentation, meditation, and the gradual development of commitment. You can see I actually framed it. I had to get myself to stop at some point. While also a recognition that much of reading experience is untranslatable and irrepresentable, no matter the form of expression. The unfinished edges and unclear meanings, touching on memories without actually representing them, while partly a rendering of the reading, are also a rendering of the caesura of meaning and feeling between the poem and myself, which opens and swells each time I read it, as I similarly open and swell when the poem reads me. I am ready, I say to the poem, which simultaneously speaks itself out loud. I am ready to be every animal you leave behind. And that's it. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. David Lewkowich, for your very poetic and thought-provoking speech. And considering about the time, I don't know whether there is time for any Q&A segment, but I wonder if you have any burning questions right now for our guests and participants.
Whether I have any burning questions?
No, I mean the audiences.
Okay. Thank you.
If not, I think you may always send Dr. Lewkowich email to follow up and have further discussions. And I want to thank you again for the wonderful speech and for everyone who participated in today's session. And the registration for the 2021 seminar series is now open on our website. So you can now register on the web page. And great. And our next session is scheduled on December the 11th. So you're welcome to join. Thank you so much.
Thank you. I just want to once again thank Drs. Phelan and Dr. Pinar for inviting me to be part of this series. It was a real pleasure, and it was a way to get my mind tuned. So thank you.
Thank you so much. Bye-bye. Have a good day.